Point-and-click adventure games are pretty weird, man.
Often patient, mysterious, unforgiving, and ultimately rewarding, they come together to form a deeply fascinating subset of video games. They generally like to rely on calculated observations, trial and error, and good old-fashioned note-taking. As such, they can understandably take some players out of the atmosphere and immersion. Constantly having to stop to write something down or having to tackle the same problem from different angles over and over is obviously not going to be everyone's cup of tea, and that's fair. These are games that really like to force the player to take their time in experimenting and thinking outside the box while still firmly rooting solutions in the world of logic. Sometimes, there are even games within the genre that satirize the very idea of the logical approach, such as The Secret of Monkey Island. Here's a game that uses common sense as a weapon against the player's preconceived notions of problem solving. Red herrings used as troll tolls, grog so acidic it melts prison locks, combat in the form of insult comedy, and constant jabs taken at the very nature of the hero's journey. This game really had it all. My favorite Monkey Island moment is when our protagonist, Guybrush Threepwood, is thrown underwater by the town sheriff with no means of escape. Tied to a log and surrounded by sharp objects just out of reach, how do we escape this predicament? You know what, Guybrush? I think you might just be right. All this to say, point-and-click adventure games and many of their common tropes were so firmly established by the early 90s that developers had already resorted to self-parody as a means of further exploring the genre. So, where do we go from here? Well, when game developer Cyan Worlds released Myst in 1993, it represented a breath of fresh air for the point-and-click style in many ways. Myst intentionally appealed to as wide an audience as possible with its emphasis on self-paced exploration, non-linear gameplay, and puzzles that favored real-world observational skills over arbitrary in-game logic. You didn't need to understand some obscure pop culture reference or dated turn of phrase to solve any of the puzzles. It was a game where atmosphere and world design came first, and actual gameplay came second. Myst prided itself on its ability to avoid common problems found within many point-and-click games, namely that of the dreaded softlock. A softlock, for the, unscathed, is a point in a game where a player can no longer progress, usually as a result of a lack of information or items from a location you can no longer return to. The most generous of softlocks allow the player to revert to a previous save and try again, generally with the caveat of having to replay certain areas and rewatch cutscenes. At their most sadistic, though, the player will have to restart the entire game with no sure idea of where they went wrong, usually losing days or even weeks of progress. Games like Space Quest 1, King's Quest 1, King's Quest 2, King's Quest 3, King's Quest 4, and King's Quest 5 were all known for softlocks of varying degrees of cruelty. Don't even think about going into the dark forest without the bottle, the amulet, and the honeycomb? Yeah, of course. Then there's the time you have to save a rat from a cat. This requires a boot? Now for my next statement, I want you to imagine the biggest asterisk you can picture. The game Myst does not feature any true softlocks. However, it does feature one single puzzle that not only defies, but fundamentally undermines the core philosophy behind the game design. If you know Myst, you know where we're going. Today, let's take a deep dive into the worst puzzle in Myst. Before we begin, just a brief explanation of Myst for those who have never played. Myst takes place on an island called Myst Island. Well, actually, it takes place inside of a book called Myst that was written by a man named Atris, who has mastered the craft of the art, which is basically used to turn locations and books into real explorable worlds that can be entered through objects called linking books. Atris had two sons, Cirrus and Achenar, who abused the worlds Atris had created. At this point, Atris is missing, presumed dead, with his wife Catherine nowhere to be found. Atris learned the art from his controlling and abusive father Gen, who disavowed Atris at birth.
There's nothing wrong.
Nothing wrong at all, you're not
going to keep talking about deep lore.
On Myst Island, we find a library with two brothers trapped in books, each ordering you to bring them pages corresponding to the color of their book. Each brother desperately wants you to ignore the other. Cirrus, in the red book, is cold and calculated. Meanwhile, Achenar over in the blue book is, Well, he's just having a grand old time. On Myst Island, there are linking books that allow you to travel to new locations, or ages, where you can find the pages these two fellas want. You can access these linking books by solving puzzles around the island. Each book takes you to unique and interesting places that all serve as self-contained worlds. You will find 2 pages, one red and one blue, in each age that you can bring back to the brothers for more, lore? However, it should be noted that the main goal of each age is simply to escape, to find the linking book back to Myst Island. This will be very important later. You see, each age tells a story visually about how the 2 brothers abused these environments and their inhabitants, all tying into a grander tale of deceit, greed, family, and a trust misplaced. Myst plants the seeds of a story that grows throughout the course of the entire franchise as it branched off into sequel after sequel, a trilogy of books, and even an MMO. So, there are only 4 ages in the original release of Myst: Mechanical, Stoneship, Channelwood, and Selenitic. They can be explored and completed in any order you choose, and I'm definitely not lying to you right now. Each age has its strengths and weaknesses from a design perspective, sure, but in order to talk about the worst puzzle in Myst, we need to go to the Selenitic age. God help me. The Selenitic age is accessed by a rocket ship controlled by a piano, because god damn it man, there is still such a thing as an original idea. The age is separated into 2 distinct areas, the first being above ground and the second taking place inside a bathysphere, or an old form of submersible. The first puzzle in the age has us navigating to strange radio towers, activating them and using a radio antenna to pinpoint their frequencies. After locating each of them, we press this button, which plays the sounds from each tower in a specific order. We'll use that order to input the sounds into this control panel on a structure located at the beginning of the age. Down below, the inevitable awaits. So the first puzzle here isn't perfect. It's easily one of the more straightforward in the game, but it does get us to explore a somewhat interesting environment, which again was the main point of the game. Cyan's whole approach is that they create unique worlds for the player to experience, while the puzzles often act as soft roadblocks that gently push the player to really take their time and soak it all in. Let it be known, I really like the first half of the Selenitic age. It's got that isolated and lonely feeling that's present throughout the whole game, but it's also incredibly alien in a way that's unique to this age. It's not the best example of Cyan's design principles in Myst, but it's better than where we're going. Time to get this over with. Let's hop inside the damn yellow submarine over here and get going. Sitting down at the controls, we see we've got access to forward, backward, left and right arrows, and a little red button. As this cutscene plays, I'll reflect on all the mistakes I've made in life. Don't drink drugs, kids. Once we're underwater, stuck in this Fisher-Price iron-lung looking ass, you'll notice that the speaker under the button emits a noise. The noise actually determines what direction you should face the submarine in order to properly navigate the level. This means north, this one is south, then east, and finally west. Sometimes 2 sound effects are combined to indicate something like make a northeastern turn and that sort of thing. Now you might be wondering, how did I know the sounds indicate directions? And herein lies the first and arguably biggest problem with this puzzle. I wouldn't have known that had I not first visited the Mechanical Age, solved the rotating fortress puzzle by associating these sounds with the cardinal directions via the Fortress Rotation Simulator, and either remembered them or wrote down a general description of each sound. Now if I haven't been there yet, is there a way to navigate the maze without using the noises as a guide? Sure. It's called taking shots in the dark like I did the first time I played this game.
I tried to be Rocket Man and Piano Man at the same time, and all I got was this lousy submarine.
One problem in, and already some pretty serious questions arise. If the whole point of Myst was casual, non-linear exploration decided solely by player choice, why tie the 2 ages together? It's not even a loose connection, it makes one nearly impossible to beat before playing the other. Secondly, was there an indication that I should have come here later than I did? Not really, unless you consider the order of the clues given to you by the tower rotation back on Myst Island. This doesn't lend itself to the organic nature of discovery within the game, though. Players don't know they need to flip the marker switches right off the bat, they don't immediately know that pointing the tower at these markers will give clues about their surrounding areas, and like me, they may have just wanted to explore each age in their own way, as Cyan intended. This is what I mean when I say that one single puzzle in the game undermines Cyan's whole intention behind the design. If one age is connected to another in this way, it doesn't only imply a specific order of approach, it demands it. I believe this reveals the biggest issue with the original Myst, and we are not finished yet. So if you were to wind up here, as I did, with no idea that the sounds were meant to guide you, how hard is it really to navigate this place? Surely there's a few dead ends, but it can't go on forever, right? I want you to take a guess at how many times you think you have to move this sub in the correct direction. 14. You have to do this 14 times. It might not seem like a lot, but that's 14 complete guesses you have to get right in a row. One dead end can throw off your entire concentration due to the repetitive visuals of the area as well. Let's look at a map of this place. I'm still dumbfounded I managed to do this without a guide or any idea I needed prior information. Even in looking at it, it's like they knew people would try following the left wall like you do in a hedge maze, so they threw all these detours near the end just to confuse you even more. So yes, you can solve the puzzle without the help of... But all it amounts to is a massive headache of trial and error mixed with the waning confidence that you're even in the right area to begin with. So we know it's not a soft lock by definition, but I do feel it teeters on the edge. Remember, we can't just go back to Myst Island and link to the mechanical age to get the necessary information. The player is quite literally forced to solve the puzzle with a blindfold on, with the only other way out being reverting to an old save. Now, if you were a certified gamer by 1993, point and click or not, you probably had a developed system for saving progress on multiple save slots. The target demographic of Myst, the non-gamer, the everyman, does not know what save scumming is, though. I'm having trouble imagining my dad back in the 90s with his massive circular glasses, face pressed to screen, focused on managing a complex series of save files to avoid problems like this. The average person has probably never heard of a softlock and probably would have assumed the game could be approached in any order, as advertised. It's tough because it can't really count as a softlock, but it's such a gray area considering who Cyan intended on playing the game. Now, I know I've already said a whole lot of negative stuff, and I promise that's going to change soon, but we gotta talk about these visuals, man. Really, it's just the same screen over and over, with the only thing changing being the gates you can pass through. Not only does it make the area more confusing to navigate, the biggest crime it commits is being wholly uninteresting. In a game where the entire focus was the carefully crafted design of each location, half of a single age is taken up by what is essentially the same screen. This is a huge problem because now there's no real environment to engage with, and the tedium of the puzzle has become our sole focus. This flat out contradicts Cyan's whole atmosphere over everything approach in a pretty heinous way. I mean, even if you did the mechanical age first and connected the dots with the sound effects, it still doesn't make for an interesting location or puzzle. If anything, it makes a huge chunk of the Selenetic age just a half-baked version of the mechanical age. We're still rotating around in cardinal directions like we did in mechanical, but that age had us wandering around its entire landscape, through rooms filled with clues and secrets about the characters and the world around us, all in order to solve the puzzle. Here, we're rotating and navigating through a dull, monotonous labyrinth, all while using the same clues we were given in an entirely different age. It's repetitive in visual design and its gameplay, both in reusing old information and in the tedium of how we actually solve the puzzle. It's also worth mentioning that the Selenetic age is the only age in Myst where the two brothers don't have their own rooms. This is a key aspect of the environmental storytelling in each other location, and its absence in the Selenetic age is certainly felt. The mechanical age excelled in that respect, with each brother having a main room and a hidden chamber, that where you can hear me deliver lines poorly. With each brother having a main room and a hidden chamber that reveals the darker aspects of each character. It's here we get a good look at Sirius's greed, learning of his plot to tax the inhabitants of the age. We also get to visit Akinar's goon chamber, which is the least surprising thing about him. The Stoneship age gives us insight into Sirius's cruel and scheming nature while further demonstrating Akinar's passion for, the macabre. The Channelwood age shows us Akinar's abilities with complex technology. This was where I also first learned of the brothers' plan to hide the means of assisting Atris in the ending. These rooms also always held each of the brothers' pages, but in the Selenetic age they're kinda just placed at random radio towers. We don't learn anything new about the two characters here, and I think it plays a big part in making even the first half of this age less interesting than the other ages. And of course there's no hidden rooms in the submarine maze either. It would have actually been interesting to have two of these detours lead to hidden chambers where we get a little more character development. The puzzle still would have been an ordeal to solve, but it would have varied the area in a way it desperately needed. So if it undermines the entire approach of the developers and makes for an uninteresting, drawn-out location, even with the required clues, why the did Cyan think it was a good idea to include this puzzle? Well, they kind of didn't. In doing research for this video, I found a Q&A discussion panel that Robyn Miller had done in 2015 titled the Myst Postmortem. Robyn Miller is the co-founder of Cyan Worlds and the co-lead developer of the original Myst, alongside his brother Rand. In the Q&A, a fan asks Robyn what the reasoning behind the submarine puzzle was.
Okay, yeah. That was our worst puzzle.
Yes, it was.
He elaborates, telling the audience that originally, that location was meant to be a massive superstructure that the player would have been able to freely navigate without any kind of vehicle. He says that due to time, technology, and budget restraints, they had to scale the idea down to what we ended up getting. In Robyn's PowerPoint presentation, it's brought up that the computers they used to render screens took anywhere from 2 to 14 hours on each individual screen. This meant they had to be confident about every detail in every screen, and that they had to know where they were going with a certain area before allocating all that time and effort towards it. If they bit off more than they could chew, it would have been a time sink the developers couldn't afford to make. Miller also mentions in the postmortem that they had definitely gone over budget while developing the game, so they really couldn't afford to spend time fleshing out the original idea or throw away what they had already rendered. I think the combination of these factors explain why we ended up getting this submersible puzzle. I have to wonder, if we had gotten that superstructure, would this have held chambers for Cirrus and Achenar? Them not being present in the age sticks out like a sore thumb, and if Cyan had gone with the original plan, I wonder what else could have been tucked away in the corners of such a location. It makes me think that this age could have actually been something grand, and given it would have been explorable without the submarine means the mechanical age connection may not have happened. Either way, it seems like the area's inclusion was simply due to a series of unfortunate compromises. They couldn't include what they initially wanted, but they couldn't not use assets and renders that cost time and money to make, so they made do with what they had. Unfortunately, this resulted in the worst puzzle in Myst.
Oh, hi guys, it's me from the future. Help!
I come from the timeline where I forgot to mention the most important counterpoint to my arguments, and now Cyan is releasing a submarine-only version of Myst, where you play the whole game like this. I mean, I still bought it. So a common claim I found from people who didn't know what the sounds meant was that if you have nothing else to go off of, you can just map the area out using pen and paper. Even Rand Miller uses this defense in the 2020 Mysterium Q&A with both him and Robyn. We've already covered most of Robyn's issues with the puzzle, but Rand basically argues that A, it still works as a maze without the sound clues, and B, mapping it out can be a rewarding experience. To which I ask, does something being technically solvable equate to it being fun and immersive? Now, I won't say it's not a completely valid argument. I'm sure the satisfaction felt by people who solved the puzzle like that must have been immense. It's a huge beast to tackle, and it's impressive that people even bothered to do that, but I have problems with this defense. The game never really sets you up to expect something this demanding of the player. I mean, think about the kind of stuff you would have had written down by this point. You have the combinations of the safe to get to Channelwood, the clock tower combination, the amount of volts needed to power the rocket ship. I mean, even the most difficult one is like 3 dates and times to get to Stone Ship. I'm not trying to outright spoil these solutions, but we're talking mostly 2 to 3 number combinations here. Nothing like this. And if you want to say, well, the puzzles to get to the ages are obviously easier than the puzzles in the ages themselves, let's take a look at some of the ages. There's realistically only 2 things you would need to write down in mechanical: descriptions of the sounds if you didn't memorize them, and then the 4 symbols needed to access the linking book. And I mean, I'm going to spoil it here a little bit, but, well, not a little bit, but this is about as complicated as that's going to get. Channelwood, you have a clear point of origin for the water flow, and you can see where it branches off. You didn't need to map out the water pipes in that age because the flow made sense visually. I didn't even write anything down for Channelwood. The first half of the Selenetic age is just walking up to radio towers, pressing a button, then going over to the antenna and finding the signal. The game would literally tell you where to stop when you were close enough. The only thing you would need to write down in that age is the order of the sounds to access the submarine. The thing is, the puzzles in the ages are a lot more tactile than the initial puzzles on Myst Island. They just don't really have you writing much stuff down. So in terms of what the game expected from the player, this defense feels terribly inconsistent with the rest of Myst's gameplay. I personally don't think they planned for people to have to map that area out, because placing that kind of expectation on the player comes out of nowhere. It feels like an oversight. I'm all for note-taking in games. It actually adds an interesting level of immersion for me that most other genres don't. This isn't immersion though. It's placing a huge burden on the player that wasn't there 5 seconds ago. I feel like if the only defense is, well, you can map it out if you want, that right there should show how poorly this puzzle was implemented into the game. The fact that people did do that doesn't change the fact that the visuals and gameplay are still boring and repetitive, and now you're expecting the player to do more busy work here than any other location? Hopefully in time traveling back to cover this, I've undone the horrors that Cyan has committed to my timeline. I'm not sure how much longer I can watch the brothers' cutscenes like this.
Blue pages.
After the massive success of Myst in 1993, Cyan began working on a follow-up right away. On Halloween of 1997, Riven was released. A direct sequel to Myst, Riven marked some fundamental changes in Cyan's approach to game development. First of all, the technology they had at their disposal was obviously an improvement over what they used for Myst. Right out of the gate, there's live-action NPCs inhabiting the same world as the player, a feature Robyn mentions in the Myst Postmortem as something Cyan couldn't attempt prior to Riven. I guess Atris doesn't count, but he's cool so he can break the rules. Now, Myst was made by a team of just about 4 people, and with the profits of that game, Cyan was able to increase in number, even hiring former Disney visual designer Richard van der Wendy, who was the production designer for the film Aladdin. Armed with a larger crew and budget, along with all the knowledge gained from creating Myst, Cyan demonstrated growth and improvement in many ways. Rand Miller, in an interview with Ars Technica, mentions his dissatisfaction with the way a lot of the puzzles were implemented into Myst. Both brothers seem to share the sentiment that the puzzles of Myst were a lot more arbitrary in relation to their environment than the puzzles in Riven. In that interview, Rand talks about how creating this synergy between puzzle and world was the biggest obstacle when it came to developing Riven. He mentions that they had went into Myst not even intending for it to have a story, a soundtrack, or really puzzles for that matter. It seems a lot of core elements of the game were added later in development and weren't pre-planned at all, which presumably made for a stressful environment in which to make a game. Rand cites the budget of Myst as one of the core reasons why NPCs weren't very prevalent and why the puzzles at times clashed with the world design. Riven sought to squander those issues. I would argue that Cyan was so successful in their endeavor that it's difficult to talk about individual elements of the game without discussing how they tie into the grander whole. Story elements, puzzles, characters, and locations all work together seamlessly. For example, let's discuss simply accessing Gen's laboratory on Crater Island. Without getting too deep into it, the basic plot of the game is that Atris' father Gen has trapped Atris' wife Catherine in an age named Riven, and it's up to the player to both free Catherine and trap Gen. Gen happens to be stuck in Riven, which is the age where Catherine was born, and has spent the last few years trying to write a linking book to escape. His laboratory is his main base of operations, and it's where we gain access to his journal. Here we gain insight into both Gen's perspective on the ages he writes, and his troubled relationship with Atris. Entering Gen's laboratory first involves the player riding a minecart to Crater Island. All over the island where we find the minecart, there are tons of tree stumps, indicating that this jungle must have been much larger than it is now. Once we reach the end of the minecart ride, we land inside an unpowered wood chipper. Turning around, we can see a massive mound of wood chips waiting to be collected. Just through this cutscene, the player now knows how Gen gathers and transports wood to his base of operations in order to make the pages for his books. And it's not just because we were told about this by an NPC, we as the player actually interact with and experience that process. Jumping back to Myst for a moment, even in the journal directly addressing the Selenetic Age, the submarine is never mentioned. There is a line in the Stone Ship journal where Atris mentions needing a form of underwater transportation in his, quote, next age. I just feel that a single line of incredibly vague text is not justification enough to say the submarine now doesn't feel arbitrary. To be overly pedantic for a moment, this line may not even refer to the Selenetic Age as it's never mentioned by name, and the mention of underwater transport in this journal doesn't provide any functional reason for its existence, and neither does the actual location. We're told in the Selenetic journal that Atris has found a chasm that he explores and gets valuable resources from, but from the way it reads, it almost sounds like this section was written when the plan was still to build the massive superstructure we could have explored freely. Even in giving Cyan the benefit of the doubt here, all these little bits of information don't quite fit together in a cohesive way. Anyways, back to Riven. We're here on Crater Island, and the player next has to deactivate this boiler room, which allows us to move to a higher point closer to the lab. This involves climbing through a sewer tunnel accessed inside the boiler room. We'll return to the boiler room in a moment, but for now let's just take stock of the area we've gained access to. Down the main catwalk, there is a frog trap we can interact with. Not only does this give the player information about the stone animal puzzle, which I won't delve into since that's just another can of worms entirely, but once we read Gen's journal, we find he extracts a compound from these frogs that he smokes in his pipe. Nice. Already, with both the minecart and the frog, we see how Gen takes from the environment around him to suit his own goals. And who better to tell the player that story but the environment itself? It's also worth noting that in order to even use the frog trap, the player has to go back to the boiler room, reactivate it, and divert power to that section of the island. We're also given the option to direct power to the wood chipper, where we get a visual of how it functions. Now we're going to enter Gen's lab through the vent above the frog trap, but how do we turn the fan off? Well, turning around and closing the doors on that main catwalk, two new paths appear. To the left, we find one of the 5 marble domes on Riven that Gen uses to power his linking books to the 233rd age, the only age Gen has succeeded in writing and linking to in years. That age is yet another dead end for him, which sounds a whole lot like a skill issue to me. To the right is the catwalk that leads to Gen's lab. Here, there's a lever we can pull to turn off the fan and finally enter the laboratory. This location, along with housing Gen's journal and all of his tools, provides the player with a method of traveling to Survey Island, where Gen would study the many instabilities of Riven, which is an age he wrote. Both Gen's and the player's way of exploring Crater Island and interacting with its components are one and the same. Our time on this island acts both as a multi-stage puzzle and a way of putting the player in Gen's shoes, demonstrating to us his process of making and powering linking books by having us follow his exact steps. I was met with a deep sense of unease when playing through Riven the first time, since the player is forced to take advantage of the environment almost as much as Gen does, simply in order to catch up to him. In progressing through the game, I kept wondering if the player is any better than Gen, purely because we've been framed as the selfless, ever-willing stranger by Atris in the opening. In the Myst Postmortem, Robyn Miller emphasizes the importance of providing the player with a thought-provoking moral dilemma, expressing dissatisfaction with Myst in that respect. In Riven, merely choosing to interact with the environment is its own dilemma, as we're shown time and time again the terrible impact that these actions have already had on the age. Not just the environment and the puzzles are interconnected, but the themes of the game are now reinforced simply in how we interact with it. It's clear that what Cyan attempted with Myst was far more fully realized with Riven. Sure, the increase in budget and manpower was hugely beneficial, but Myst taught its developers through trial and error what kind of story they really wanted to tell. Not only that, it showed them how to tell it. Like I mentioned earlier, Myst wasn't initially intended to have puzzles, or even a narrative. Yet it's the interconnectivity between these features and Cyan's trademark world design that make Riven as immersive and emotionally resonant as it is. We have all the strengths and weaknesses of Myst, and yes, even the submarine puzzle, to thank for that. Though it was a misstep, it was a step that needed to be taken in order for Cyan to be able to look back and learn from their own mistakes. Riven doesn't have a single puzzle that cuts me off from clues I may not have gathered yet. Even the most annoying puzzle in the game still isn't arbitrary in relation to the story or the world. It's gained infamy in the Myst community for its reliance on pixel perfection, but I can just turn around and walk away from it, inching ever closer to a solution. To quote directly from the works of the great poet Alfred Tennyson, "'Tis better to have tried the fire marble puzzle and failed than to have never left the submarine maze at all." Did he really say that? Well, folks, that's going to wrap up today's look at the worst puzzle in Myst. I sincerely thank each and every one of you for tuning into this here abomination. This video was a pleasure to make, and I learned way more about the creative process behind these two games than I ever expected to. The wealth of information out there regarding all things Myst is astonishing, and I'd like to give a huge shout out to the people who go out of their way to document as many details about these games as possible. Speaking of Myst stuff, I'm currently doing a series where I do readings of all the journals and all the Myst games, and would love to do another analysis like this if you all have a specific puzzle, age, or anything you'd like to see me do a deep dive into. I'd love to do like a lore analysis on Gen and Atris' relationship, and since I didn't go too in depth with it in this video, I could see doing like a deep dive into the fire marble puzzle if that's something you guys would want to see. Let me know. Anyways, have a great rest of your day. See, that's why I don't do that.